Welcome back to our special MPC broadcast. The Reserve Bank Governor Elize Kruger announcing that the Reserve Bank has decided to cut interest rates by 25 basis points, taking the repo rate to 7.5%. I'm joined in studio by Elize Kruger. She's an independent economist, and Annaline van der Poel. She's the COO at Debt Rescue. Thanks very much, ladies, for joining us. Let me start with you, Elize. You're always quite critical of the Reserve Bank for being far too conservative. What do you think about this latest 25 basis point cut?
Nampu, yes, on the day, I think this is the best that we could have hoped for. I think there was no chance for a bigger cut than 25 basis points. However, if I look at the revised CPI forecast for 2025 at 3.9%, it's really surprising to me that they did not even consider to hike, to cut a bit bigger. Because really, if you look at that 3.9%, if you look at the 2.7% neutral rate, you are talking here about scope for further cuts in interest rates, and it doesn't sound like that is on the table at all.
Annaline, this is good news for consumers, especially those who are heavily indebted.
Indeed, it is. But, we've got to put it into the big picture and to say, okay, we're going to see a few $100 savings maybe on a bond or a vehicle. But looking at the current predictions, we're probably looking at a fuel price increase next week. So, they're just cancelling each other out at this point. So from a consumer perspective, good news, but not good enough, unfortunately.
So, Elize, I see that the governor was quite clear that he does see the inflation risks on the upside, really citing external risks or external issues.
Yes, indeed. So currently a lot of the global factors are very uncertain, especially since Trump has taken office. I mean, almost every morning one needs to look at what happened overnight in the US, or there may be some surprise announcements in terms of policy or tariffs. So yes, there's a lot of uncertainty, but I think we've got some fat built into our current inflation environment. If you look at our 3.9 forecast now towards 4.5 is a 0.6, a lot of things will have to happen, I would say, to the wrong side of expectations to push us a lot higher than 4.5. So there is definitely scope for us to still move in interest rates a bit lower in light of the fact that we are seeing numbers that are closer to the bottom side of our target band. And this economy is still struggling to gain momentum. I mean, we will have for last year probably 0.8% at best in terms of real growth. We are trying to get the economy moving, and monetary policy could play a bigger role in that.
So, Annaline, as we get excited on the one hand about a rate cut, like you said, there are other pressures that come our way, almost cancelling out, that benefit. And we've just seen that NERSA has announced that it's going to allow Eskom to have a 12.7% increase for electricity tariffs. They were looking for a 36.1% increase, so thank goodness NERSA came to their senses. But of course, that's still way above the current inflation rate, so that's going to be more pressure for the consumer.
Absolutely. I mean, all these items just keep adding up. So from a consumer perspective, again, 12% is a lot of money on an absolute necessity. And we have to also then ask the question, there's a reason why NERSA asked, or why they've asked for this specific percentage. What happens in the event that they're not getting it now? What does that mean for our infrastructure and the future of, possibly looking at load shedding again, which again puts, businesses under pressure, it puts consumers under pressure, and job stability and, work and unemployment. So there's a lot of factors we have to look at on the ripple effect on what this means. But, thank goodness, agreed, definitely happier with that than a 36%.
Absolutely. So, Elize, the governor kept on talking about administered prices. It's something that he's always raising, and Eskom's tariffs are one of those administered prices. So how does that, what's that going to do to the inflation picture? It's information that we've just got now. You haven't had time to really calculate it, but what does that do to the inflation picture going forward?
Well, if you look at the detail of inflation modelling, this 12.7% is now actually good news, because I think the Reserve Bank had incorporated a higher tariff increase, like 14.5%. So in the very short term, that could result in a slightly further drop in the forecast. But overall, as you mentioned, it's way above the average inflation rate. And from that point of view, it remains an inflationary component of the CPI basket. And I can just see in future that if we can incorporate more private electricity generation, prices will come down. So once you get to a point where municipalities not only buy from Eskom, but also from, say, a renewable power project on the outskirts of town, which is a lower tariff, you can start to see a weighted average cost of electricity coming down, and then it will start to alleviate these pressures from administered prices. But where we are now, we are still seeing, year by year, notably above inflation for increases for not only electricity but also the municipality tariffs like water and so on. So we've got a problem in that regard, and government will have to come to the party in that sense. I mean, it's out of the hands, but where we do see private sector coming into play now, we can start to see those administered prices coming down over time. But it's not a short-term phenomenon. It will take time before we see that.
Yeah. All right, ladies, we're going to pause it there, and we're going to take a quick break. We'll have more for you after a short one. To join us as I'm in conversation with Elize Kruger. She's an independent economist, and Annaline van der Poel. She's the CEO of Debt Rescue. Thank you very much, ladies, once again for being in conversation with me. Elize, let me start with you on this occasion and just talk about the growth picture. Reserve Bank Governor Elize Kruger talked about growth of up to 2% by 2027. Hooray, but at the end of the day, we need a much higher number to begin to deal with our social issues, not to mention, paying off our huge debt as well.
Indeed, Nampu. So at least slowly but surely we are moving into a higher growth trajectory, partly due to the fact that we have started to focus on structural reform. But I think for the year of 2025, we also have a low base of calculation. If we look at last year, it turned out to be another dismal year for South Africa's growth. So this year should give us about 1.7%, at least as somewhat above our population growth. It would be the best growth in a couple of years. But from there onwards, we need to continue to focus on structural reform to take us forward and to lift our growth potential. And from that point of view, we are making progress, but one can perhaps say still slow. And what we are seeing in terms of policy changes now, especially in terms of the network industries, Transnet and the ports and so on, will only really bear fruit for us in 3 years' time. So as we've seen with electricity as well, we had policy changes about 3 years ago, and then it started to kick in for us in 2024 with more generation from the private sector side and so on. So these things unfortunately take time. Luckily on some fronts, like for instance the visa side, we've had good news last year, so that could this year already kick in to be a good stimulus for the tourism sector. But some of those are taking longer, and we will only see the impact of that in the medium term. But in the meantime, hopefully on a cyclical front, things like interest rates, lower inflation, real wage increases could help the economy getting a bit of momentum.
Yeah, so Elize is very good at giving us the bigger picture stuff. And of course, I'm focusing on you for what's happening with the consumer. Just give us a sense of what your observations are around how the consumer fared over the festive season. Do you have a barrage of people knocking on your door in January because they overspent in December and November? What's the state of the consumer right now, and what's your expectation for the consumer as we go forward in the year? You raised the issue of, fuel prices perhaps going up, and we've also had the conversation about electricity prices going up effective April and then July for municipal customers. What are your expectations?
Unfortunately, the expectations are not looking great. I mean, if we look at the small impact that this rate cut is going to have in the big picture, realistically, for the average consumer, we did some surveys late last year, beginning of this year, again, to get an understanding of how are consumers planning on spending, the festive season in terms financially, and then doing a January survey and asking them, so how did they fare? And I think most consumers had good intentions with really trying to stay within a budget, etc. But our January survey did show us that more than 60%, almost 65% of consumers told us that the cost of living has just, unfortunately, inflation, etc., has put them in such a position that they have zero savings to fall back on. Now we start a new year. It's been school fees and uniforms, etc., that they have to purchase over and above your normal monthly expenses. 75% told us they didn't even get bonuses at the end of this year. So that unfortunately leads to a situation where consumers are going to be left and have been left without any alternative but to turn to credit. And if we do not see further interest rate reductions and we see all these additional expenses keep incurring, it's not going to get better for consumers. And absolutely, it's been a very, very indicative in our industry by the number of consumers desperately seeking help.
All right, ladies, I think we're going to pause it there as we need to go for a quick break, and we'll discuss further. We'll see you in a moment. And so we continue with Elize Kruger, independent economist, and Annaline van der Poel. She's the CEO of Debt Rescue. Thanks very much, ladies. Elize, I wanted to talk about the rand, that element that's familiar to all of us in the country. How do you see that faring over the year, and what were the impressions that you got from the governor? He talked a lot about dollar strength. We've seen quite a bit of dollar strength on the back of the Trump presidency. And of course, dollar strength is negative for emerging market currencies like South Africa, because it then means that our currencies will, relatively speaking, be weaker. And if they're weaker, it means the potential of importing inflation, because we buy most of our products or import most of our products denominated in dollar. So what's your view of that whole picture?
Yes, the rand, as always, remains a difficult one to get a handle on. But I think the fact that we've seen the dollars, steaming ahead since Trump's election is indeed a negative signal in terms of the rand's performance for the year. The dollar has come back slightly, but I mean, on sort of balance, it's a lot stronger than what we thought it would be by now. Because, the scenario before Trump was really quite a few more cuts in US interest rates, which would have reduced the appeal to take your capital to the US. But now there's so much uncertainty in the world that the safe haven flows are just all piling into the US and, resulting in this stronger dollar environment. So I think the rand will be weakish. If you look at it on average, it might be similar to last year, which was around about 18.40 rand on average. So I think we could not expect a huge rally in the rand this year. But we might have, periods where we see a bit more strength. And I think that could be linked to our own structural reform, measures, our own growth. Once we start to see a bit more, positive growth numbers coming through, it could be positive from the capital flow point of view. I think a lot of investors are hungry for piling into potential projects in South Africa. But we haven't seen those flows really, starting to impact on the rand.
Yeah.
So I would say on balance, weakish for the year, but hopefully, towards the end of the year, somewhat stronger.
I know economists usually shy away from giving political, impressions, but what about the whole issue around the GNU? People think it's a bit wobbly now as there's discord around the signing of certain bills into law, and that it could suddenly crash, even though John Steenhuisen, the leader of the DA, says, no, that's not the case. They'll fight internally and get it sorted. What are your thoughts around the political side of things, which ultimately affects things like the rand and our economy?
Yes, indeed. The GNU was one of the big confidence boosters of 2024. So if we suddenly see a retracement in the relationships around the GNU, it will definitely be negative. And we've seen that. And I think it's been a contributing factor to some rand volatility in the last week or two. So if it's going south, it will definitely have a negative impact on the rand, because I think part of what we've seen in terms of the recovery was indeed positive sentiment about what the economy could look like in a different political environment. And we need that actually to take us forward. If the GNU would collapse, that would be hugely negative for the whole country, and also for our structural reform, progress and so on. So I think these jitters, I hope it will, go away. I think we spoke a lot about coalition politics, that it will be a roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
And we are seeing a bit of that. I think the first few months maybe was a bit of a honeymoon. Didn't quite feel too bad in the few months after the election. But now that we're starting to get to the nitty-gritty of policy, things are heating up, and hopefully we can find it. Well, the parties could find each other around the table, but if not, it could be an added layer of volatility volatility and uncertainty for the economy.
Annaline, you know, the consumer seemed to show massive strength when we looked at the retail number that came out for November. That was up nearly 8% on a year-on-year basis. We know part of that was obviously because it was Black Friday month and also the two-pot. To what extent do you think that's going to taper as we go into 2025? And just in terms of tapping onto the two-pot, that's something that you can do every year. What would you say to consumers who may be tempted to use that as a facility each year? Because if they do that, it means that they'll have less money when they actually retire.
So I think to answer the first question in terms of the impact, definitely the festive season, and it now pretty much starts with Black Friday month, we definitely do see an increase in spending. What the spending is on is obviously also very, very interesting, and how the dynamics have shifted there. But I do think it's gonna taper off and you know, probably find a midpoint. Consumers only have so much money and access to funds to a certain point. With regards to two-pot, that is something that since it's been tabled, we have been really cautioning consumers to please think carefully. We know that the Reserve Bank governor, one of his recommendations was, if you're going to take it, use it for debt. Get rid of your debt. And there we're in complete agreement. However, yes, you can take 1/3 of, you know, obviously what you've contributed since the two-pot system started, plus that little seeding capital. So, and it gets taxed, you know, so we've always got to remember there's all these elements, and then the long-term effect, because ultimately your savings for retirement are compounded interest. You know, it keeps growing, it keeps adding value every month and every year. So if you start tapping into that now, it's really going to put you in a much worse off position. But we understand why consumers are doing it, because they truly have it as the only method sometimes, if they're not getting a bonus, that they use this almost in lieu of not having a bonus to, you know, get through the festive season or maybe the New Year's expenses. But from a cautionary perspective, please try and avoid it so that you can take care of yourself ultimately when you reach retirement age.
Absolutely, because as well, it just becomes unsustainable if a lot of the population don't have money, because then government has to kick in.
Exactly.
And that puts more stress on government. Let's come to government finances. Governor Kganyago always talks about public debt. It's something that he always rants on about every time he speaks to us from the MPC. He talked about that. We're around the corner from budget. Are you confident that we're going to continue seeing National Treasury balance the need to deal with our debt, that is, reduce it and deal with the debt service cost, while also having to cater for all the myriad of imperatives that there are in the economy that they have to service?
Number, yes, it remains a balancing act. I think on the one side, I'm concerned that last year's growth was lower than what the Treasury hoped it would be. So that's already going to have an impact on tax receipts and also on all our ratios, you know. So it looked, I think, in terms of projections, quite a bit better than what we might end up with the final outcome for FY25. And also, if you look at the current public sector wage, you know, agreement that's been out there, I'm not 100% sure whether it's finalized yet, but it's already been like a percentage point above what was budgeted for.
Even more than that. I think they offered 5.5% and their original position was closer to 3%.
Okay, so already there's some slippage on the expenditure side again, you know, so sometimes we find a lot of that in the budget, so there's a good intention to keep, for instance, the salary bill under control, up to the point where there's negotiations and then it slips again. So by the time we get to budget, the actual outcome looks worse. So from that point of view, you know, I think we cannot look out for miracles in this coming budget. It will most probably be status quo, which is not necessarily bad, i.e. we're still hanging in there, not giving in to populist demands. But in the same sentence, you know, there are slippage again, and, you know, we will have to be very careful, especially given that growth is now, again, a bit of a question mark, especially with global scenario as well.
All right, Elize, they're talking in my ear. Let's take that quick break, and then we'll come back. I'm joined in conversation by Elize Kruger, independent economist, and Annaline van der Poel. She's the COO of Debt Rescue. I really wanted to ask you, ladies, about your wish list or your wish item as we conclude. Annaline, what would you hope could change in the economy to give consumers a bit more oomph?
I think obviously we'd like more interest rate cuts, and that would be the first and most important thing. But the second thing that we really need to start focusing on is unemployment. Our unemployment figures are still insanely high, and the reality is the only way you can grow an economy is by spending, and that can only be done by job creation, and ultimately government gets their revenue, whether it be through VAT, or pay as you earn, whatever the case may be. That is probably one of the biggest solutions we need right now is tackle the unemployment problem.
No doubt, Elize, you would argue that monetary policy needs to be more supportive.
Yes, indeed. I do think currently, if you look at the status of our inflation environment and you look at the current levels of interest rates, it remains a scenario where the real rate is unnecessarily punitive. Currently sitting at, say, 3.6% versus neutral at 2.7% in my view right now, even despite the fact that there are distant risks that could derail our story a bit. I think there's still room for further cuts, and we need monetary policy to be also a stimulant for growth. We cannot look at fiscal policy. As we mentioned, debt levels in South Africa are already unsustainably high. So we can't look at the fiscal side to stimulate the economy. But on the monetary side, I believe there's still a bit of room. And I wish that we can look into that direction. That will in the whole, in the bigger picture, also assist investment projects. Once you start to lower your cost of capital, there are more projects that become viable. That will start to grow the economy. That could create some more jobs. So it's actually a bigger picture story of we need to almost have all guns shooting in the direction of more growth.
Yes.
Because that could lead to more job opportunities. And then we can slowly start to alleviate the unemployment problem.
All right, ladies, thank you so much for your time and your contributions there. I've been joined by Elize Kruger, independent economist, and Annaline van der Poel, COO at Debt Rescue. And that's pretty much a wrap of it. If you are joining us at the 11th hour, the Reserve Bank has cut interest rates by 25 basis points, with the repo rate now standing at 7.5% and the prime lending rate standing at 11%. We're going to go for a quick break, and then I'll leave you in the capable hands of Unati thereafter. Take care.